Hello, welcome to this Gluware tutorial video. In this tutorial, OS Manager Part 1, we're going to cover the prerequisites for using the OS Manager app for automating changes like OS upgrades and downgrades. This tutorial will cover licensing, role-based access control, the OS Manager specific settings, and the Gluware file server. So let's get started by signing into this Gluware instance, which I'm using our Gluware test drive system, which is demo.gluware.com. If you're using the test drive, you can follow along with this tutorial. So let's get signed in. Okay, so here I am signed into Gluware and I am navigated into a particular org, which is the test drive-pod 4. These are demo orgs, again, for demo purposes and folks kicking the tires on Gluware. If you'd like to request a test drive, just go to gluware.com and you can complete that request. So to get into this tutorial, we're going to start by navigating into the organizational settings. So from the nav bar, we go to settings and organization. From a prerequisite standpoint, the first thing I'll cover is that OS Manager is a licensed application, so it does require purchasing and licensing to be enabled in your system. So if you go to the licensing view, you're going to see active licenses. You'll see OSM, which stands for OS Manager, and you should have that license enabled. If you don't have the license enabled, you won't be able to use this solution. Next is we're going to go into role-based access control. Another component that's important to understand is that when your system is administered, it should be administered by enabling roles for the designated user activities. If there are operations users that you want more guardrails and limitations on, or if they are developers where you want full access to the Gluware system and no limitations. So I'm going to just show you here in a particular role we have called the test drive user. I'm going to edit this role and show you a couple examples of things that must be enabled for using this solution. So as I scroll down here, you're going to see a whole section for the OS Manager app. Role-based access control gets pretty granular. So you see, just enabling access to the OS Manager solution, allowing image validations and overrides, managing catalogs, OS plans. So all of this is turned on. We want test drive users to be able to really exercise the app and experience it. One thing that is not required, we're not doing at this time, is the use of catalogs. We'll talk about that a little bit more in this tutorial and next, but basically a catalog is enabling a catalog of specific folders and images for a specific reason. The most common reason is that those images are approved for use in your organization. So catalogs are recommended, but they're not currently being used in the test drive. One other category I'll highlight here is there is a section for file server. So this permission allows you to access the file server solution, but we are not enabling management of files. This is primarily because we don't want users of test drive uploading images that Gluware doesn't necessarily have the rights to use. And also, we don't want test drive users deleting files that are could be used by other users. So we do not allow the management of files. And so that really kind of completes the role-based access control that are, let's say, specific to OS Manager and the file server. So next, let's go into the OS Manager settings. So you have a navigation here into OS Manager settings, and let's go through this. Again, this is a prerequisite in terms of making sure this is configured correctly for operations within your organization. First is you're going to see the setup for a file server. One thing that's important to note, if you don't already, is that when you create an organization, in this case, this is the test drive pod 4, organizations you can think of as tenants. And you want to be able to have isolation from the tenants, but you may also want common properties between tenants. So when you create an org, you have the option to inherit things from the parent org. And that's the case that's happened here, is that we've inherited the file server configuration from the parent org. So I do have a file server that's configured and connected here. We're not going to go through the whole file server setup and install, but just note that when you install Gluware, we have a universal install image. And when you install it, you have the option to select the personality of that image. And so one of the options is to configure the Gluware file server, and you can have one or more in your organization. Most times it is recommended that you install file servers close to the largest grouping of devices that you have, and so that you can kind of minimize the cost on the network and the time it is required to transfer the images to those devices when you're executing a transfer step. So that's file server settings. There's really nothing to do in the test drive. Next is port settings. Again, that you're not configuring these because these are enabled and configured that are inherited. And so these are not to be changed. Just note that, again, we support TFTP, FTP, and SCP as transfer protocols. And so you see the ports required here. Gluware uses port 2022 for administration. We also then support these standard protocols. SCP, a secure copy protocol, uses SSH. So we do, have to have the SSH port open. So generally, we're not advising you change the well-known ports, but note that in your network as an enterprise, you must have these ports open and available for communication to successfully, operate the OS Manager app and the file transfers. In this next section around SSH protocols, SSH has been around for a long time, and SSH is used when you're using SCP for Secure Copy Protocol. So when Gluware needs to communicate with all the vendors we support, like Cisco, Juniper, Arista, HPE, and others, we have to be compatible with the SSH key algorithms, ciphers, and MACs that they are using. So what you see here are all of the various settings that we've installed to be compatible with the vendors we've onboarded. Each time we onboard a new vendor, we add to these. Now, if your particular organization had requirements of using specific algorithms or ciphers, you could potentially disable or delete some of these out and then limit some of the choices used in the negotiation. So we don't generally have customers edit these sections, but it is possible when needing to, when complying with some internal or external compliance around keys and algorithms and ciphers related to transfers. The next section down is around image selection and validation. Again, we have the concept of cataloging or enabling a catalog, which is kind of your ability to facilitate the use of specific images. We are not enabling that in the test drive, but again, we do advocate the use of catalogs so that it is clearly understood which files are recommended for each platform and which ones are approved for use. This next checkbox enables a validation that occurs when you're building a plan and go through validation, which will be in part 2. But basically, this is enabling vendor API image validation. This is currently only supported for Cisco at the time of this release, which is Gluware 5.3. What you do have to do is in the integrations section, you configure your Cisco support API credentials. And then when you are building your plan and you select various Cisco devices and the operating system image that you're using, we're able to make an API call to Cisco to validate that the image you are selecting is compatible with that serial number SKU that you're looking for, that you're looking to execute. So just another form of a validation. So you're not attempting to transfer an image or even worse, reboot a device to try to use an image that is not compatible with the device type. This next section is around how the jobs are executed. Gluware's default is to execute parallel jobs. We have a job queue and we have various threads that we're able to do things concurrently. I believe in the test drive, we have it configured for 10 concurrent jobs that, depending on the install and the scale of the machine, this can be customized. It could be 50 current jobs, it could be more. It really, again, is dependent on the install and the capacity. But the key to it is that if you have failures in your job, what do you want it to happen? So If you want to, instead of operating in parallel, you want to operate in linear for some reason, you would tick this box here. If you then want to abort on a certain failure rate. So I think this is mostly useful in the testing phase prior to a big OS rollout. In the testing phase, you want to fail faster and understand how things are going to happen. But ideally, once you've tested and validated, and you know the images are compatible, you're not expecting failures, then chances are you're going to want to run more of a parallel operation, but it just so the job completes much, much faster. However, if you are the case where you don't want to, if you haven't had a chance to significantly test, and then this is, let's say, a first site you're rolling out upgrades to, you may want to abort if, let's say, there's 10% of failure, you may want to just abort the job and then reassess why failures are happening and then make sure that those failures don't continue. I'll give you a really simple example is that one of the reasons it can fail is that one of the Gluware health checks, it's looking at, was the last configuration saved? And so somehow if in your network there hasn't been good hygiene, people are making changes manually, and those changes you want them to be saved. If they have not been saved, Gluware does a check because we don't want to change the OS, reboot, and then reboot back to a config that the saved config versus the running config in the case of Cisco. So that is just an example where you don't want a lot of failures, so you could abort quickly, and then you can go and make sure you have saved configs, and then you could proceed on and have high success with your jobs. Allow re-execution of failed plans. So the default behavior with the plan is when you fail a plan, you don't re-execute the plan. You would clone the plan and then run the new plan. And so you would want kind of record of those failed plans. Ticking this box allows you to take a failed plan. Again, let's say it failed because you didn't save a config. You can go on that device, save the config, and then just rerun the plan. So that would allow you to do that if that's within your company's policy. Skipping device validation for transfer only. So the idea here is that there is a bunch of validation steps that occur when Gluware is performing a transfer only and then a deployment. And the idea here is that when you're doing the validation, it does take time. So it takes time to perform all those validations. And again, validations could cause failures of the plan. So to avoid that, you may want to skip validation and just get it transferred. And then you may want to perform the validation when you're going to deploy. So that is an option as well. Next, we're going to get into a new section here introduced in Gluware 5.3 called options. So as I was kind of beginning to talk about, Gluware implements OS upgrades based on the vendor's best practices, and I would say very conservative ways in which we would prefer to fail than upgrade and have a more significant issue going forward into the upgrade. So we, by default, run a bunch of pre-checks and validations and would like to ensure the best chance of executing an OS upgrade or downgrade, whatever is happening. What options give the user is more control on a per OS basis as to what they want to enable or disable. So like, for example, in 5.3, Cisco has been supported both iOS XE and NXOS, and you can see some of the options that are exposed. So I can skip the standard file integrity check. I can skip the boot statement health check. I can skip the device health check for transfer only. So we are going to be exposing more and more of these options and more vendor OSs. In fact, within a few months of this release, there will be a package update, a package delivery or package update you'll install on your system that is going to expand vendors and options. So this is new, but this is just giving the user much more granular control on the operations and to be able to turn off things. And the main reason for this is that all of those checks, again, can cause failures of plans when that may not necessarily be what you want. The other component to raise is that all of the checks do add extra time. And we've had situations and users who need to complete OS upgrades within a window, and a maintenance window. And so they want to ensure that's going to happen, and they're confident that they don't need all the extra pre-checks. They've already done the checks. So in that case, they're going to just skip those checks and execute whatever job they're running, if it's transfer or deployment. So there are reasons to do it. The thing to mention here is that these are at the settings level. So whatever you configure at the settings level will be inherited into the OS plans that you build. When you view part 2 and you're building your plan, these options will be inherited. There is the ability to override these options in your individual plans, but just note that the starting point for them are here in your OS Manager settings. Whatever you configure here is inherited. With all that being said, we're going to move on to the next step here, and just to understand a little bit more about the Gluware File Server app. Let's navigate into Gluware File Server. And here you can see the file server, which is a really basic view of really a simplified file server functionality. And I am logged in with my credentials, which allows me to administer the file server. But basically, you have the ability to create folders. I've created 3 folders here. This test drive system has Cisco CSR 1000Vs. We have a Cat3K. We have NXOS device. We have a Junos device. Those images are not here. In the test drive, we are really offering the ability to change, kind of upgrade, downgrade versions on the CSR series devices, as well as there's a single 3750, a physical catalyst switch that's part of each pod. And the idea is you can come and exercise upgrades and downgrades. So when administering the file server here in the File Explorer, you can add files. This allows you to upload images to your file server. You can edit those files and the properties of them, and you can delete them. So here I have the folders that have been created, and in each folder are the images. And then I can double click on the image and see details about it above, which in this case, the name, the vendor, file size, checksum, path, all of this information. I do want to call out now, and I'll do it in part 2 as well, is that Gluware does require the use of the Gluware file server. And just in the years we've done this, and in many years of supporting third-party file servers, there were a lot of administrative challenges and issues. And so we made the decision to just provide our own native file server. And it really has simplified the configuration of it and really minimized problems and issues. So you basically load your images in. I will say also that when you have multiple file servers, Gluware will automatically sync the files to all the file servers. So we have a sync design that happens where you're uploading a file to the master file server. The master file server will then replicate those files down to all of the additional file servers you're using. So we do that synchronization so that you have those files available across your network and wherever you need them available. So there's really not a whole lot more to cover here, in that just you have the creation of folders, you have the ability to upload images, and then you can move those images into your folders, and then you could administrate those, or you would have in your operations guide, and through the folks using Gluware, you would be explaining exactly what's in policy of the jobs that they're creating. So in this case, we'd be assuming that, let's say these were the 2 approved images to use for the CSR 1000Vs, which is 9.16.9.2 and 9.16.9.4. And maybe there was a job to go and upgrade from .2 to .4, maybe to resolve a bug or expose more feature sets. And that would be why you would be doing that. So that covers the basics of the Gluware file server. But essentially, once these images are in the system, in part 2, you'll see how you build OS plans to go ahead and use those files when you're performing a transfer or a deployment of the image. So that concludes this part 1 of the OS Manager. Thank you.